today's movie review, we get to do something different for a new movie review, which we haven't done, which I should have done a long time ago for today's movie review, is Fantasia. Fantasia was released on November 13th, 1940, which Walt Disney had a lot to do for when it's basically using the use of classical music with some animation. There was no talking in the animation, but it's always set to classical music as well. So for the production on Fantasia, how it began, after the success on one of Disney's classics like after Pinocchio and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Fantasia is under the working title as the concert feature. But before that, Walt Disney first met Leopold Stokowski at a restaurant in Hollywood called Jason's Southern Pit, where they wanted to do like the scoring for the music for The Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey Mouse at the time as well. Yeah. And this was pre-World War II dollars probably as well. As what for had Fantasia had a lot to do for its own sake as well. Not only they hired Leopold Stokowski, but they also hired Deems Taylor, who was a composer, radio commentator, an author, and was also a professor, because he was very famous at the time as well. For the thing of how they changed the working title to Fantasia as well, they wanted to make something with how the music was composed by the Philadelphia Orchestra as well. As when Fantasia was the groundbreaking movie, what Disney had a lot to do as well. And this is the first Disney movie with combining with classical music set to the animation as well, particularly for how it all be to start with as well. And yeah, because this was probably how your typical with the interstitial commentary by Deems Taylor on each segment in the movie Fantasia has started to begin with as well. And that's how you expect as well. And yeah, because Fantasia is one of the most important movies what Disney had a lot to do in the 40s as well. With the music from the works of Bach, Stravinsky, Beethoven, and many other classical music artists as well. As well, particularly of how the abstract animation and Toccata and Fugue in D minor from Johann Sebastian Bach, as well as probably as the Nutcracker Suite, because there was just basically any types of the dances as well as the Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey Mouse, which is probably has like the traditional Disney animation, because that's probably how Disney made Mickey Mouse famous as well, particularly since the 1930s as well. And yes, and there's also the dinosaurs in the evolution of the creation of the origin of life on Earth in The Rite of Spring, which is probably predating Jurassic Park as well, particularly. And the Pastoral Symphony, they originally wanted to do it as Pure Day Si Delise, but instead they used Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, particularly with mythological creatures like unicorns, fawns, as well as Pegasus the flying horse and the family, as well as the centaurs and the centaurettes as well. And yes, this is probably how there's other characters like Bacchus, the god of wine, as well as Vulcan and the king of all the gods, Zeus, who is the god of thunder as well, particularly in the Pastoral Symphony sequence in Fantasia, particularly. And the Dance of the Hours is like a parody, is basically adapted from Ponchielli's suite from the opera La Gioconda as well, particularly. The dark and scary, terrifying, hellish nightmare of Night on Bald Mountain, as well as the solemn oath of Franz Schubert's Ave Maria as well. And yeah, that's basically how they combining two different pieces of music, especially the music have struggled between good and evil, which is basically a continuing theme of many of Disney's cartoons, especially the fairy tales like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But instead, because the evil characters in all of the sequence in Night on Bald Mountain are basically ghosts, demons, and witches, and other monsters as well, including the one who is the star, who is from Slavic mythology, Chernobog, the god of evil in Slavic mythology, who is basically the star of this particular sequence in Night on Bald Mountain and the Ave Maria sequence in Fantasia as well. Until the coming of the dawn, especially the church bells, until the nuns come out with these lights to the Ave Maria sequence in Fantasia, particularly. When Fantasia was re-released, probably originally part of the roadshow experience as well, and when it was first came out in 1940, it only played at about 25 theaters, but it was considered a failure, as it wasn't enough money for the box office, particularly as well. As well as Fantasia has been using as a roadshow experience, they equipped it with Fantasound, which is basically like a hybrid of a film presentation and a concert, particularly as well, because they used to call it like a roadshow attraction. RKO Radio, the distributor RKO Radio Pictures, has no involvement with Fantasia because they said it was 2 hour long and it was too long. So they had a term with Disney's approval by 1942 comes. They had to cut the 124-minute version of Fantasia to an 81-minute popular version, which has probably over 81 minutes of music. And all of the interstitials with commentary by Deems Taylor were removed, and including the opening segment, the toccata and fugue was removed from the program entirely. And apparently, even though I've never saw that version, but it was probably played on a double bill with a Western movie as well, in general. And then they played it as simply as, say, Make My Music or Melody Time, which those films came out very shortly after the war, which is basically the package films of the 1940s. Until 1946 comes, and then Fantasia is brought back to the general release versions with a short interstitial commentary by Deems Taylor, and the toccata and fugue sequence has brought back in there. When Fantasia was re-released in 1956 on the Super Scope screen, which is probably your typical CinemaScoped feel to this movie, what Fantasia had a lot to do with particularly. And yep, and also back in the 40s when it was used to be a roadshow attraction, I mean, this includes the intermission on there, particularly when the Fantasia title card was projected onto the on-screen title card on the curtain, but at the Carthay Circle, it does not include the on-screen title card on the projection as well, which includes in the balcony or any other large upstairs area for any roadshow experience with Fantasia. But RKO had no involvement for Fantasia when it was re-released in the 60s, so Buena Vista Distribution could handle it as well. When it was re-released in 1969, which is probably part of the psychedelic experience in the 60s, when many young adults and teenagers have watched the movie while they were on drugs as well. When Fantasia was re-released in 1981, it was in stereophonic sound as well. But until 1982, which is a year later, they wanted to re-release Fantasia with the help of Irwin Costell, who was the composer for Mary Poppins movie, particularly, as well as the Disney Studio Orchestra, of how they re-scored all of Stokowski's music score from the original Fantasia soundtrack. After the 1956 Fantasia Soundmaster went wrong, so they re-recorded, and Deems Taylor's narration has been removed in 1982. So instead, they hired Hugh Douglas to do all of Deems Taylor's narration in 1982, until Fantasia was re-released again with the 1982 Dolby Digital soundtrack by Irwin Costell. It was basically re-released in 1985. And the narration for Deems Taylor's narration is voiced by Tim Matheson in the 80s. And yes, it was played nationwide, particularly. I mean, the cost for the fitting of the theater for Fantasia was probably about $1 million, particularly in the 40s, because it was pre-World War II dollars. When World War II was already underway to Europe, because the threat, they were not able to release Fantasia overseas until World War II is over. And yeah, that's probably it's just how it is for what Disney had a lot to do for Fantasia. Until 1990 has come, they restored Fantasia to its original restoration from the 1946 general re-release version. Back since 1946, all the hisses and popping sounds were removed, so they wanted a cleaner, crisp sound for the better restoration to begin with as well, including the original Deems Taylor narration has brought back, as well as the original music from the original Fantasia soundtrack has brought back to its release after the 1982 re-release of Fantasia with the Dolby Digital stereo soundtrack with Irwin Costell release has gone quite popular, particularly, of how Fantasia became a cult picture as well as it became a Disney classic, particularly as well. And they did a lot of stuff for. It was so different than any other movie has done before, which is basically the work of art, particularly for Fantasia. And yet, the 1990 re-release Fantasia has the end credits, and it's not the roadshow version, because one woman called or wrote the studio, complained that her husband was missing from the movie, because he was one of the performers appearing in the previously unavailable roadshow scenes. And yes, it was the version that I loved watching on the VHS on the deluxe commemorative edition set, and that's what I grew up with as well. The segments in Fantasia are all right. Like, I'm not a fan of the soundtrack sequence in it, but I thought the Ave Maria sequence was kind of too depressing and as well. But I did love the dark moments in of how the hellish nightmare scenes of how for Night on Bald Mountain had to begin with. I also love the Rite of Spring sequence in Fantasia because it predates Jurassic Park. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is the best sequence in Fantasia because it's basically 100% pure Disney traditional animation of how you begin. But overall, this movie seemed to become a classic. Fantasia not only made me know the animation and the storytelling, but it's partially inspired, such as my previous movie review on Allegro non troppo from Bruno Bozzetto, and my first anime review on the 1987 anime compilation film OVA, Robot Carnival. Speaking of Night on Bald Mountain, the Night on Bald Mountain sequence was also referenced in the 1987 anime movie Robot Carnival, as well as Fantasia has its Italian take from such as Bruno Bozzetto's 1976 film Allegro non troppo, since Bruno Bozzetto has seen Fantasia at the movies 12 times, particularly. And yes, Fantasia is now available on if you could watch it either on Disney Plus or you can get it on VHS or DVD or Blu-ray as well. So that's gonna be it for my movie review for Fantasia for today. Thank you for watching. But before we go, here's my thoughts. I really admired the movie because it's basically your typical Disney movie with animation being set to classical music as well. Of how I appreciated this movie for its timeless inspiration for how I start my review that I haven't done before until now. And yep, because you're taken on a journey for inspiration.